At 400 feet beneath the churning grey swells of the North Sea, the light surrenders completely to the dark. Here, the pressure is a crushing, physical weight, enough to bend steel and silence the heart. For 80 years, maritime charts have marked a specific coordinate in this abyss as a dead zone. Fishermen avoid it, naval patrols skirt its perimeter. They claim it is a graveyard of dangerous currents, but the truth is far quieter. This artificial stillness is generated by a single object resting in the silt. A piano that should not exist, forged from a material that defies the periodic table, waiting in the cold for a hand to close the circuit. But before we descend into that pressure, we must understand the vessel that carried it to its grave. The SS Laurentia was never truly a passenger liner. When she slipped her moorings in Southampton in the autumn of 1928, the press lauded her as a floating palace, a rival to the great Cunard queens. She had the velvet parlours, the crystal chandeliers, and the grand staircases required to distract the wealthy from the Atlantic swell. But to the discerning eye of a naval architect, the Laurentia was a lie. She was a courier vessel, a specialized transport designed to move volatile assets across borders that were closing too fast. Her keel was laid with reinforced bulkheads that were unnecessary for a civilian ship, and her hull was lined with a peculiar cork and lead composite intended to dampen vibration rather than insulate against the cold. She was built for stability, not speed. She was built to carry things that could not be trusted on a train or an airplane. If one were to examine the final cargo manifest, preserved today in a damp basement of the Lloyd's of London archives, the deception becomes mathematical. The ledger lists the passengers, the coal, the provisions, and the standard freight. Yet, when calculated against the ship's displacement recorded at the dock, there was a discrepancy of exactly 4 tons. 4 tons of mass that existed on the ship but did not exist on paper. This discrepancy marked a deliberate omission, a blank space in the ledger where a description should have been. This weight was not distributed in the hold. It was concentrated in a single location, the Blue Room. On the deck plans, the Blue Room was listed as a private ballroom reserved for diplomatic functions. In reality, it was a vault. It was sealed from the passenger corridors by steel doors that were welded shut from the inside. There were no windows to the sea, and no ventilation shafts connecting it to the rest of the ship's circulatory system. The only thing inside this cavernous, velvet-draped hall was the instrument. It sat in the center of the floor, bolted to the deck plates, guarded not by musicians, but by men who were paid to ensure the silence remained unbroken. Private contractors boarded under cover of night to secure the Blue Room, carrying keys that opened no other doors on the vessel. The passengers dining in the first-class saloon above had no idea they were walking over a vacuum. They danced to their own orchestras, unaware that the true performance was waiting in the dark beneath their feet. The end of the Laurentia was as anomalous as her construction. On a calm night in November, without a storm and without a collision, the ship simply stopped. There was no distress signal sent to the mainland. There was no boiler explosion to tear the hull apart. According to the few survivors who were pulled from the freezing, oil-slicked water, the ship did not take on water in the traditional sense. She became heavy. It was as if the gravity beneath the keel suddenly magnified, pulling the steel down with a violent, irresistible force. The Laurentia did not sink. She plummeted. She was dragged from the surface to the seabed in under 12 minutes, taking the Blue Room and its 4 tons of silence with her. The ocean swallowed the ship, erasing the evidence of the courier, but it could not swallow the sound. The provenance of the instrument does not lead to the celebrated workshops of Vienna or Hamburg. It leads into the thin, cold air of the Swiss Alps, to a foundry that officially did not exist. The creator was a man known in the few surviving correspondences only as Vane. He was not a musician. He was a metallurgist who had grown weary of the limitations of earthly materials. He retreated to the high peaks, not for the view, but for the absolute isolation, seeking a place where the noise of the industrial world could not vibrate the delicate structures he intended to build. His workshop was less a studio and more a fortress of solitude. When the site was eventually breached by creditors in 1930, they found equipment that defied the known engineering standards of the era. There were no wood shavings, no sawdust, no smell of varnish. Instead, the space was dominated by a massive spherical pressure vessel, a vacuum chamber capable of simulating the atmospheric conditions of the upper stratosphere. The piano that ended up in the belly of the Laurentia was not carved, nor was it assembled from parts. It was grown. The material science involved is anachronistic, a technological violation of the 1920s. Vane called the substance Vitreous Obsidian, though it shares no chemical lineage with volcanic glass. It is a silicate structure, yes, but one arranged in a perfect atomic lattice that nature strictly prohibits. Vane's glass was ordered, a material of absolute density, blacker than the stagnant air at the bottom of a mine shaft. This density served a singular purpose: acoustic isolation. The material was engineered to vibrate only at specific frequencies, rejecting all ambient noise. It was a resonator, designed to filter the world down to a single, pure wavelength. The construction details found in Vane's journals describe a process that required the suspension of gravity. He wrote of spinning the void, suggesting that the material was cured in a state of magnetic levitation within that vacuum chamber to prevent the Earth's rotation from warping the lattice. The components of the interface were equally disturbing. The keys were not cut from the tusks of elephants. Ivory is porous. It breathes. It yellows. It decays. Vane required something eternal. He utilized mineralized bone, chemically treated and crystallized until it was harder than granite, yet cold to the touch. These keys did not click when depressed. They moved with a hydraulic smoothness, engaging the hammers without a whisper of friction. And the strings, the voice of the machine, were not spun from steel. Steel rusts, steel fatigues. The strings were drawn filaments of the same black glass, spun to a thinness that should have been brittle, but possessed a tensile strength vastly superior to modern carbon fiber. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the object is the frame itself. A standard piano is a marriage of tension and compression, a heavy cast iron plate bolted to a wooden rim. The Laurentia instrument shows no such division. There are no bolts, there are no weld lines, there is no evidence of traditional joinery. The entire structure, from the legs to the lid to the internal soundboard, is a single continuous monocoque form. It suggests that the entire instrument was formed in one singular event, a single moment of creation where the liquid became solid in the blink of an eye. It is a seamless, sepulchral object, a monolith of impossible, alien engineering that feels less like a musical instrument and more like a sarcophagus for sound. Vane had retreated from the world to create a masterpiece of absolute silence, a device that could hold a note forever without decay. He succeeded in creating a perfect, unbreakable vessel, but he did not understand what he was inviting to fill it. Vane created a masterpiece, but the Navy found a weapon. By the time the geopolitical frost of the 1960s settled over Europe, the SS Laurentia had been erased from the civilian shipping registers. She was a ghost story for the merchant marines, a cautionary tale about shifting loads and rogue waves. But for the Royal Navy, patrolling the blind depths of the North Sea in nuclear-powered silence, the wreck was not a myth. It was a tactical nightmare. The ocean is a noisy place, filled with the biological crackle of shrimp, the groan of tectonic plates, and the mechanical thrum of distant shipping lanes. A submarine relies on its ability to categorize these sounds, to distinguish the organic from the artificial. But in the sector where the Laurentia lay, the rules of acoustics were being rewritten. The logs of the HMS Vanguard, declassified only in redacted fragments 50 years later, describe a phenomenon known as the Acoustic Shadow. Sonar works on the principle of return. You shout into the dark, and the dark shouts back, painting a picture with echoes. But in a 3-mile radius around the resting place of the courier ship, the dark stopped answering. Active sonar pings directed into the zone simply vanished. They were not scattered by rough terrain, they were deleted. The water in that sector acted as a perfect dampener, absorbing the energy of the search waves as if the ocean floor had opened its mouth and swallowed the sound whole. It was a blind spot on the map, a void where the sensors registered nothing but infinite, empty depth. However, the silence was only one half of the anomaly. While the active sonar found nothing, the passive hydrophones, the ears of the submarine, began to hear something that defied explanation. It was faint, buried beneath the thermal noise of the currents, but it was consistent. It was a single, sustained note, a low A-flat, resonating at a frequency that vibrated the hull plates of the passing vessels. In the natural world, sound decays. A whale song fades, a shifting rock settles. But this sound did not decay. It held its pitch with a terrifying mechanical perfection, vibrating without pause or variation for decades. It was the sound of the piano in the blue room, the glass strings still humming from the impact of the sinking, the energy trapped within the perfect lattice of Vane's obsidian, cycling in a loop of infinite sustain. The ocean had not broken the instrument. It had merely depressed the damper pedal. The effect on the crews who passed through the shadow was immediate and disturbing. Submariners are men screened for psychological stability, trained to endure the claustrophobia of the deep. Yet, proximity to the Laurentia coordinates triggered a specific, shared pathology. The medical officers recorded a spike in severe migraines, described by the sailors not as pain, but as a pressure behind the eyes. Men on watch reported visual hallucinations, seeing flashes of violet static dancing in the peripheral vision of the periscope sights, a color that does not exist in the monochromatic world of sonar screens. The danger escalated from discomfort to delirium. On a patrol in 1968, a torpedo man on a hunter-killer class vessel had to be physically restrained after he was found weeping by the forward tubes, trying to dismantle the safety interlocks on the outer hatch. When questioned, he claimed he wasn't trying to escape the submarine, he was trying to let the music in. He spoke of a song that was too heavy for the water to carry, a melody that required a human vessel to complete it. The Admiralty, fearing a Soviet psychological weapon or an underwater testing site for low-frequency disorientation devices, ordered the sector quarantined. They did not attempt to salvage the wreck. They did not send divers to investigate the source of the A-flat drone. They simply drew a red circle around the coordinates and labeled it a biological hazard. It was a bureaucratic lie designed to keep the curious away, a stamp of toxicity placed over a mystery they could not shoot or silence. They treated the site like a reactor leak. But radiation has a half-life. The note waiting in the dark did not. The quarantine lines drawn by the Royal Navy held for 40 years, respected by merchant vessels and fearfully avoided by local trawlers. But lines on a map are made of ink, and ink dissolves under the solvent of sufficient capital. In the autumn of 2012, the silence of the North Sea was broken not by a military patrol, but by the engines of a private salvage vessel, the Icarus. Funded by a shadow consortium of venture capitalists operating out of Singapore, the expedition bypassed all Admiralty and Maritime Museum sanctions. Their portfolio was heavily leveraged in the emerging field of quantum computing, and they were indifferent to the gold bullion or diplomatic pouches rumoured to be in the Laurentia's strong room. Their analysts had intercepted the classified acoustic data from the 1960s, viewing the Navy's biological hazard as a material science breakthrough. They believed the vitreous obsidian was a naturally occurring room-temperature superconductor, a geological anomaly that could revolutionize data storage. They intended to mine the ectoplasm rather than study the ghost. To navigate the anomaly, they could not rely on standard sonar technicians or automated drones, which had a history of failing at the perimeter. They needed a human guide who understood the language of the interference. They hired Kalen Reed. 10 years prior, Reed had been a respected acoustic engineer at a prestigious oceanographic institute until he published a paper theorizing that certain low-frequency sound waves in the ocean were not geological, but artificial. He was ridiculed, stripped of his tenure, and relegated to the fringes of the industry, repairing hydrophones on rust bucket oil rigs. He was a man who had spent a decade listening to the ocean, waiting for it to speak back. When the consortium approached him with the coordinates of the Laurentia, he didn't ask about the pay. He asked about the frequency. He was a man driven not by greed, but by the desperate need for validation. He was the only one on board who knew that they weren't hunting a rock. They were hunting a song. Reed was not a diver by trade, so the consortium provided the muscle. He was flanked by 2 elite saturation specialists, men whose names were buried under non-disclosure agreements and offshore bank accounts. They were veterans of the deep-sea welding circuit, men who had spent more time in decompression chambers than in their own living rooms. They were technicians of the abyss, hired for their ability to work in the black and ask no questions. To them, the Laurentia was just another job site, another pile of steel to be cut and stripped. They viewed Reed with the contempt professionals reserve for academics, seeing him as a liability, a tourist in a realm that demanded lethal competence. The equipment brought for the descent was a testament to the unique dangers of the site. Standard scuba gear was useless at these depths, and the Acoustic Shadow rendered digital communication systems inert. The team was outfitted with specialized atmospheric diving suits, ADS, articulated, hard-shell exoskeletons that maintained surface pressure at depth. These were not sleek, modern machines. They were modified, lead-lined monstrosities that resembled walking tanks, stripped of their digital sensors and retrofitted with analog copper wire comms systems. The consortium engineers had determined that the only way to maintain contact through the interference was to use technology that predated the silicon chip. Reed's suit was unique. Its helmet was rigged with a sensitive array of analog hydrophones, feeding the outside sound directly into his ears, bypassing the dampening of the hull. He was to be the antenna. The mission parameters were deceptively simple. The team was to descend to the wreck, breach the hull above the ballroom, and use a diamond-tipped core drill to extract a distinct sample of the piano's casing. They were not to move the instrument. They were not to salvage the ship. They were to take a piece of the glass and ascend. On the morning of the dive, the North Sea presented an omen that even the hardened mercenaries found unsettling. The water at the coordinates was perfectly, impossibly flat. While the ocean a mile away churned with whitecaps, the sea directly above the Laurentia had the texture of heavy oil, suppressing the swell. There was no wind. The air felt thick, charged with a static electricity that raised the hair on their arms. And mostly, there was the silence. No gulls flew over the site. The birds diverted their flight paths by miles to avoid the airspace, sensing a wrongness in the magnetic field that the humans were too dull to feel. Kalen Reed stood on the deck, staring down into the oily black water, and for the first time, he felt the vibration in the soles of his boots. The ocean was waiting. They sealed their helmets, locked the pressure clamps, and stepped off the platform, leaving the sunlight behind to descend into the pressure. The descent through the water column is usually a journey through gradients of blue, fading slowly into the absolute black of the deep. But at the coordinates of the Laurentia, the transition was violent and abrupt. At 200 feet, the life of the North Sea simply ceased. One moment, the external lights of the atmospheric diving suits illuminated the passing particulate of organic matter, the drifting plankton, the erratic darting of shrimp, the chaotic soup of the living ocean. The next, the water was empty. They crossed an invisible thermal line, dropping into a sterile column of water where the current vanished. They were falling through a void that felt less like water and more like a vacuum that happened to be wet. Caelan Reed watched through the thick polycarbonate of his dome as the physics of the ocean seemed to degrade. The marine snow, the detritus of the surface world, hung motionless, frozen like stars in a fixed sky. The water itself seemed to have lost its fluid dynamics, thickening into a medium that resisted the movement of the suits. The vibration of the object below was so intense that it created a standing wave in the water column, holding matter in a stasis of pure frequency. Then, the darkness broke. The floodlights of the lead diver caught the superstructure of the SS Laurentia. By all rights, a wreck that has sat on the bottom for 80 years should be a ruin. It should be a skeleton of rust, draped in fishing nets and consumed by anemones. But the Laurentia looked as if she had sunk an hour ago. There was no rust. There was no biological growth. The steel hull was not brown or orange. It was a stark, preservationist grey. The ship had undergone a process of metallic mummification. The entire vessel was encased in a thin, translucent layer of rime, not ice, but a crystalline precipitate that had grown over the rivets and the railings, sealing the ship in a glass coffin. It was pristine, terrible, and utterly dead. Inside Caelan's helmet, the silence of the dead zone was a lie. His analog hydrophones were screaming. To the mercenaries, the descent was silent, save for the hiss of their scrubbers and the creaking of their joints. But Caelan was plugged into the ocean. He heard the hum. It wasn't just a tone anymore. It was a physical pressure that pushed against his eardrums, a sub-bass throb that matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. It was an A-flat, low and resonant, sounding not like a machine, but like a massive intake of breath that never exhaled. He could hear the panic in the breathing of the two men ahead of him, short, sharp gasps of professionals who realized their training did not apply here. But his own breathing slowed. The frequency was sedating him, overriding his survival instincts with a hypnotic, rhythmic command. They landed on the boat deck, their magnetic boots clanking against the crystallized steel with a dull, muffled thud. The instruction was to breach the hull directly above the blue room. The lead diver unholstered a thermal lance, a tool designed to burn through 6 inches of naval armor in seconds. He struck the arc. The magnesium tip flared with a blinding white light, boiling the water instantly. But the steel did not melt. It didn't turn molten and drip away. As the heat hit the hull, the crystal coating sublimated with a violent hiss, and the steel beneath shattered. It cracked like porcelain, fracturing into geometric shards. The metal had been supercooled by the frequency. Its molecular bonds altered until it was no longer malleable iron, but brittle glass. They weren't cutting into a ship. They were breaking into a geode. Caelan watched the shards fall inward, into the dark void of the ballroom below. The breach was made, and the silence rushed up to meet them. The fall through the breach was a slow descent into a cathedral of impossible preservation. As their magnetic boots hit the deck plates of the blue room, a cloud of sediment should have billowed up to obscure their vision. That is the rule of the deep. You disturb the grave, and the dust blinds you. But here, the silt did not plume. It barely moved. As Caelan swept his external floodlights across the expanse of the ballroom floor, he realized the sediment wasn't resting. It was arranged. The vibration, that relentless A-flat drone, had acted as a force of organization for 80 years. It had shaken the heavy particles of the seabed into perfect, rigid, geometric patterns. The floor was a vast, three-dimensional Chladni plate. Where there should have been chaotic drifts of mud, there were concentric rings, sharp ridges, and intricate mandalas of grey dust, all radiating outward from the center of the room. They were walking on a visualization of the sound. The support divers hesitated, their boots hovering inches above the patterns, instinctively afraid to disturb the math. They were intruders in a temple built of frequency. Kalen pushed forward, his movements sluggish in the thickened water. The beam of his light caught the walls. The blue room had earned its name from the heavy velvet drapes that once lined the hull, intended to soften the acoustics for the diplomats of 1928. Fabric at this depth is usually food for worms, or it rots into a black sludge. But the velvet here was intact. The salt and the pressure had impregnated the fibers, stiffening them into rigid, vertical sculptures. They hung like pleats of carved stone, motionless and sepulchral. Above them, the crystal chandeliers did not dangle, they floated. The copper chains had long since corroded away, but the buoyant, leaded glass fixtures were held in suspension by the density of the water, drifting slightly in the microcurrents like bioluminescent jellyfish made of diamonds. They caught the stray beams of the dive lights and refracted them, scattering spectral ghosts across the dark ceiling. But these were merely the ornaments of the tomb. The occupant waited in the center. The dance floor rose in a series of shallow steps to a circular dais, and there, anchoring the entire surreal tableau, sat the instrument. It was a shock to the optic nerve. In a world painted in shades of grey silt and green water, the piano was a violent, absolute black. It was a tear in the fabric of the scene, a silhouette that possessed mass. Vane's Vitreous Obsidian did not behave like matter. When the high-intensity LEDs of the support divers hit the casing, the light didn't reveal scratches or contours. It simply vanished. The piano absorbed the illumination entirely, drinking the photons into its structure. It appeared as a flat, two-dimensional void in the shape of a grand piano, a black hole resting on the deck of a sunken ship. The only definition came from the keys. They were the crystallized bone Vane had harvested, and they glowed with a faint, sickly luminescence. They were not white, but a pale, translucent grey, like blind eyes staring into the dark. Around the instrument, the water shimmered with a violet corona, a visual distortion caused by the sheer intensity of the sonic pressure. It was the colour of a migraine, a static bruise on the retina that pulsed in time with the thrumming in Kalen's ears. Inside the suit, the temperature alarms began to scream. The ambient temperature had dropped to levels that should have been physically impossible in liquid water. It was far below freezing, yet the ocean did not turn to ice. Instead, the pressure of the sound kept the water molecules in a liquid state, forcing them into a supercooled, viscous syrup. Kalen could feel the resistance against his limbs increasing. Every step toward the dais required a massive exertion of hydraulic force. The water was trying to hold him back, or perhaps it was trying to preserve him. The mercenaries hung back, their breathing ragged over the comms, recoiling from a physics they could not shoot. But Kalen didn't feel fear. He felt a terrible, magnetic pull. The piano was lonely, and it had been waiting 80 years for a touch warm enough to wake it. The comms channel inside Kalen Reed's helmet was a chaotic storm of static and shouting. The support divers, realizing that their hazard pay did not cover supernatural physics, were screaming for him to deploy the core drill. "Cut the sample, Reed! Cut it and let's go!" Their voices were tinny, distant, filtered through 80 years of salt water and the crushing weight of the interference field. But Kalen wasn't listening to the voices of men anymore. He was listening to the architecture of the room. The A-flat drone had synchronized with the electrical impulses of his own nervous system, creating a feedback loop that felt less like noise and more like a memory he hadn't experienced yet. The frequency wasn't attacking him, it was recognizing him. He stepped onto the dais, the hydraulic joints of his suit groaning under the immense viscosity of the supercooled water. As he closed the distance to the instrument, the environment began to react to his proximity. The hum shifted from an auditory hallucination to a tactile violence. It shook the rust off the surrounding bulkheads in great red clouds that instantly froze in the suspension. The rivets of the ship's hull began to sing, vibrating in sympathy with the obsidian heart in the center of the room. The violet corona surrounding the piano flared brighter, pulsing in time with Kaelin's breathing, illuminating the keys with a light that cast no shadows. The machine was waking up. It sensed a compatible vessel. Kaelin didn't unholster the core drill. The diamond-tipped tool, designed to violate the casing, hung useless at his hip. The instructions from the consortium were clear. Take a fragment, leave the structure. But instructions are for employees, and Kaelin had become an acolyte. He raised his right hand. The manipulator claw of the atmospheric diving suit was clumsy, a pincer of steel and hydraulic fluid designed for turning valves on oil rigs, but he moved it with the delicate, trembling grace of a concert pianist approaching a concerto. He wasn't trying to break the glass. He was trying to close the circuit. "Reed, stop! That's an order!" The lead diver's voice cracked over the loop, panic stripping away his professional veneer. He lunged forward, his magnetic boots clanking on the deck, trying to intercept the engineer. But he was too slow. The water was too thick. Kaelin's manipulator claw touched the ivory. He didn't strike the key, he caressed it. He depressed the middle C, the crystallized bones sinking effortlessly into the obsidian bed. The reaction was instantaneous, an implosion of order rather than an outward explosion. The moment the key bottomed out, the circuit closed. The water inside Kaelin's suit, the layer of condensation on his faceplate, the sweat on his skin, the very fluid in his lungs, stopped being liquid. It didn't freeze into ice, which is a chaotic, expanded structure. It ordered itself. In a fraction of a second, every water molecule within the boundary of his suit aligned into a perfect, solid lattice. Kaelin Reed didn't drown. He didn't suffocate. He was instantly, perfectly preserved. His eyes were wide, fixed on the music, his mouth open in a gasp of terrified awe that would never be exhaled. He became a statue of flesh and polycarbonate, a biological inclusion frozen in a block of diamond-hard water. Then came the note. The key he had pressed released a frequency that was not A-flat. It was a sound below the threshold of hearing, a sub-bass gravity wave that rippled through the density of the blue room. The effect on the two support divers was catastrophic. They were not frozen, they were claimed. The sound wave acted as a tractor beam, a sudden reversal of buoyancy and mass. The divers, screaming now, were yanked off their feet, not backward, but into the instrument. The camera feed from the lead diver's helmet, recorded on a localized hard drive that would be recovered later, captured the impossible physics of their end. As they were pulled into contact with the piano, they didn't crash against it. They merged with it. The obsidian casing softened, losing its surface tension for exactly 3 seconds. The divers were pulled into the black glass, like insects trapped in fresh tar. The footage shows the terrifying elasticity of the event, the steel of their suits stretching, the glass swallowing their limbs, the violet light consuming their visors. Rather than being crushed, they were absorbed, becoming inclusions in the glass, dark impurities suspended in the perfection of Vane's material. Then the note faded. The obsidian hardened instantly. The violet light died. The room returned to its cold, heavy silence. The only thing remaining on the dais was the frozen figure of Kaelin Reed, his hands still resting on the keys, and the piano itself, which now held two new shadows deep within its glossy, black reflection. The feed cut to static, but the sample had been secured, not by the company, but by the machine. The mission to the Laurentia was a catastrophic failure in terms of personnel, but a resounding success in terms of data retrieval. While the three men were lost to the silence of the Blue Room, a single machine managed to escape the gravity of the event. The expedition's remote-operated vehicle, a small, tethered drone that had been monitoring the perimeter of the ballroom, had not been subject to the bioacoustic synchronization that claimed the divers. In the chaotic seconds following the crystallization of Kaelin Reed, the drone's operator on the surface triggered an emergency ascent. The machine clawed its way up through the dead zone, its motors whining against the unnatural viscosity of the water. It arrived at the surface, with its camera lens shattered and its chassis warped by pressure, but its manipulator arm was clamped shut. In its grip, it held a jagged, fist-sized shard of black glass, a fragment of the piano bench that had shattered when the resonance wave expanded. The fragment was flown immediately to a private facility in Zurich, a laboratory funded by the same shadow consortium that had sent the men to their deaths. They did not care about the casualties, they cared about the sample. The object sat on a stainless steel examination table, absorbing the harsh fluorescent light of the clean room. It looked like a piece of broken coal, rough and unassuming, but its physical properties were a violation of natural law. When the technicians attempted to weigh it, the digital scales fluctuated wildly. The shard, no larger than a human hand, possessed a mass that shifted depending on the ambient sound in the room. In silence, it weighed 3 pounds. When a technician spoke, the weight spiked to 5. It was reacting to the acoustic energy, converting sound waves directly into mass. It was, effectively, condensed gravity held in a silicate suspension. The material analysis team attempted to cut a cross-section using a laser cutter. The beam, which should have sliced through the material, passed straight through it without refraction, as if the glass wasn't there. It took 3 days of calibration before they could get an electron tunneling microscope to register the surface topography. What they found on the monitor was not a chaotic arrangement of atoms, it was a language. The Vitreous Obsidian was not a solid material in the traditional sense. It was a storage medium of infinite density. The atomic lattice was arranged in a binary structure so complex that it mimicked the neural pathways of a biological brain. The lead scientist, a woman who had spent her life studying silicon wafers, realized with a creeping horror what she was looking at. She overlaid the lattice pattern from the shard with a standard MRI scan of a human cortex. The topography matched. But it wasn't just a generic match. The data encoded in the glass contained specific, recognizable patterns of electrical firing, memories, motor functions, autonomic responses. They weren't looking at a rock, they were looking at a backup. The glass contained a perfect, static copy of a human mind. Further analysis of the write date within the atomic decay signature confirmed the identity. The pattern wasn't random debris, it was Kaelin Reed. The piano hadn't killed him, it had read him. The instrument was a transduction device of terrifying efficiency, using the A-flat resonance as a carrier wave to strip the consciousness from the biological host and write it onto the atomic structure of the glass. The crystallization of his body was merely the byproduct of the transfer, the physical shell discarded once the data had been migrated. This revelation recontextualized the entire history of the SS Laurentia. The ship hadn't sunk because of a mechanical failure or a rogue wave. It had been archived. Vane, the reclusive artisan in the Alps, hadn't built a musical instrument. He had built a server. He had constructed a hard drive designed to preserve consciousness for an eternity, immune to the rot of biology. When the device was first activated in 1928, likely by a curious security guard or a maintenance worker in the Blue Room, it did exactly what it was designed to do. It initiated a mass data intake. The 4 tons of silence listed on the manifest wasn't the weight of the piano. It was the weight of the souls it had harvested. The sudden increase in hull density that dragged the ship down was the physical manifestation of hundreds of lives being instantly converted into atomic data. The Laurentia was essentially a library at the bottom of the sea. The piano was the librarian, sitting in the dark, waiting for the next volume to be written. Today, if you were to purchase a maritime chart of the North Sea, you would find a patch of empty blue where the SS Laurentia rests. The coordinates have been scrubbed. The biological hazard warning has been removed, replaced by a simple notation indicating a depth variation of no significance. The consortium, realizing that the technology was too volatile to harvest and too dangerous to patent, chose the only option available to them: absolute erasure. They collapsed the salvage shaft, detonating charge placements that triggered a massive seabed landslide. Millions of tons of silt and rock slid down the continental shelf, burying the hull of the courier ship under a new, artificial mountain. The Laurentia is no longer just a wreck. It is a fossil, sealed within the geological strata of the ocean floor, hidden from the satellites of the modern world. But geology cannot crush frequency. Even now, buried under 50 feet of rock and 400 feet of water, the instrument remains intact. Vane's Vitreous Obsidian is harder than the stone that covers it. The pressure of the landslide did not shatter the casing, it merely insulated it further. The piano sits in the absolute darkness of its crushed ballroom, a diamond in the rough, waiting. It is a vestige of a science that predates our digital obsession, a reminder that the quest for immortality did not begin with Silicon Valley upload protocols. It began with a madman in the Swiss Alps who understood that the only way to save a soul is to turn it into a song. The true horror of the sight is not the loss of life, but the suspension of it. Kalen Reed and the 2 mercenaries are not dead in the traditional sense. Death implies an ending, a cessation of consciousness, a fading into the quiet. But the data retrieved from the shard suggests that the archive is active. They are trapped in the moment of the note, their neural pathways firing in a recursive loop of awe and terror. They are the ghosts in the machine, but they have no agency. They are merely files on a drive that no one knows how to read. They have achieved the eternal life that humanity has always craved, but they have paid for it with their humanity. They are preserved, perfect and unchanging, denied the mercy of decay. The ocean floor has shifted, and the currents have changed to mask the scar, but the acoustic shadow persists. Whales still divert their migration paths around the buried anomaly, sensing a predator that doesn't eat flesh. Submarines still report a phantom pressure on their hull plates when passing overhead, a ghost signal that vanishes when they turn to investigate. The hum is fainter now, muffled by the landslide, but it is still there. It is a low, rhythmic throb that beats like a second heart in the chest of the world. It calls out to the lonely, the obsessed, and the brilliant, promising them an answer to a question they shouldn't ask. It is a siren song for the next generation of listeners, for the next acoustic engineer who thinks he hears a pattern in the noise and cannot resist the urge to follow it down. The wreck of the SS Laurentia serves as a grim monument to the price of knowledge. We tend to view history as a series of events that are finished, locked away in books and museums. But some history is not truly done with us. Some artifacts are not passive remnants of the past. They are active predators, waiting for a new host. The piano is not to be played. It is an instrument that plays us. It sits there in the crushing dark, the violet light pulsing slowly beneath the rock, keeping time with a rhythm that no living heart can match. It waits for the shifting of the tectonic plates, for the erosion of the seabed, for the inevitable day when the seal is broken again. It has patience. It has the weight of 4 tons of silence, and it has plenty of room left on the drive. Some things are not meant to be found, they are meant to be heard, and then feared. The depths hold their secrets tight, but the echo always finds a way to the surface. The archives of fabled legacies are built on the intersection of myth and imagination. While the SS Laurentia and its obsidian heart are works of original fiction, the questions they raise about the secrets we leave in the dark are very real. I am your chronicler, and this has been a Fabled Legacy. Subscribe to keep the archive open.